The built environment provides the backdrop to our everyday lives. It plays a significant role in forming our natural, economic, and cultural perspectives. There's enormous challenges facing our planet today, and the built environment, as one of the main consumers of energy and resources, offers us a plausible framework to address these issues. Green building gives us a viable way forward in constructing healthy indoor and outdoor spaces, reducing our collective ecological footprint, and in taking our next great leap as a society in the necessary transition to a sustainable built environment. Buildings consume significant resources during their design and construction, both in terms of capital and in the raw materials that go into their construction. The clearing of land for development, which in many cases involves forest clear cuts and bulldozers, throws the delicate ecosystem right out of balance. Now, this doesn't even mention the extraction, manufacturing, and transportation of these same building materials, which pollutes the air, the land, and the water. Looking at the bottom line, sustainable design and construction, which is often called green building, is a fundamental necessity in order to help us blunt the worst effects from climate disruption. Green building reduces environmental damage and pushes project teams to reach ever higher in pursuit of regenerative buildings, which inherently do more good than harm to the natural environment. The U.S. Green Building Council, formed in 1992 to promote and encourage green building. The mission of USGBC is to transform the way buildings and communities are designed, built, and operated, enabling an environmentally and socially responsible, healthy, and prosperous environment that improves the quality of life. USGBC develops the LEED Green Building Rating System as a primary tool in service of achieving this mission. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design and recognizes best-in-class design and construction practices. This comprehensive free online course will provide you with everything you need to know to pass the LEED Green Associate exam, which demonstrates an understanding of these environmental imperatives and a basic understanding of the LEED Green Building Rating Systems.
Welcome to Green CE's LEED Exam Prep Program. Green CE is an education provider with over 100,000 subscribers. Green CE provides free and premium education courses for architects, engineers, interior designers, contractors, and other design professionals. In addition, Green CE works with building product manufacturers to develop AIA and GBCI education courses, health product declarations, and product specification programs. Your presenter today is Glenn Phillips, Director of Sustainable Education at Green CE. Glenn was a significant contributor towards the creation of the LEED 2009 reference guides and the LEED AP Study Guide series. Glenn has worked with retailers, school districts, architects, and commercial building owners to help implement sustainable building practices. He has played a central role in the development of several sustainable building rating systems, including Earth Advantage Commercial and LEED for Retail. We will now begin our presentation.
By completing this course, the student will be able to explain the various LEED rating systems, categories, and minimum program requirements, list the requirements, strategies, and intent of each credit in LEED version 4 for new construction, identify the core concepts and define key terms behind green building, differentiate between the many reference standards used by LEED version 4, such as ASHRAE Standard 90.1 2010, Green Energy Product Certification, and the California Department of Public Health Standard Method version 1.1 2010. And identify best practices for achieving a sustainable project site, such as site selection, reducing building footprint, and restoring native vegetation to reduce the impact to the environment. Determine appropriate water-saving strategies, such as using non-potable water and selection of water-efficient fixtures to reduce the use of municipal drinking water for non-drinking purposes. Prioritize strategies related to energy use, such as energy efficiency, use of clean energy, and ongoing operations to maximize payback and diminish impact to the environment. Relate material selection to life cycle assessment with concepts such as extending building stock, redirecting resources back to the manufacturing process, and sourcing locally harvested materials in order to reduce the environmental impact of using virgin materials. And finally, explain the ways in which building processes and operations can affect projects' indoor environmental quality, such as access to daylight and views and implementing an indoor air quality management plan. Let's look at some of the concepts that underlie all of green building. Central to the concept of green building is what's known as the triple bottom line. That goes by many names: people, planet, profit, the 3 E's, which is environment, economics, and equity, or a host of other terms. At the root of all of this is giving each of these 3 components equal importance. So in practical terms, triple bottom line accounting means expanding the traditional reporting framework to take into account ecological and social performance in addition to financial performance. By doing this, we are able to capture an expanded spectrum of values as well as criteria for measuring organizational and societal success. The phrase triple bottom line was coined by John Elkington back in 1998, so it hasn't been around very long, in his book Cannibals with Forks, the triple bottom line of 21st century business. Following the idea of the triple bottom line, we consider how each of the 3 aspects relates to the built environment. Our health relates to people. Resource management is the planet or the environment. And finally, the financial benefits, should be readily apparent, relates to the economics and profit, which definitely deserves a place in this triple bottom line. With LEED fundamentally an instrument of market transformation, it's important for LEED to engage building project teams by tying these program requirements, which are collectively known as credits, prerequisites, and minimum program requirements, more on that in a bit, I promise, to specific goals that the LEED program is trying to attain. What we see here are LEED's system goals. These are also known as their impact categories. Now, these 7 impact categories were developed and approved by the LEED Steering Committee for use in LEED version 4, and they're as follows: reverse contribution to global climate change, enhance individual human health and well-being, protect and restore water resources, protect, enhance, and restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, promote a sustainable and regenerative material resource cycles, enhance social equity, environmental justice, and community quality of life, and finally, build a greener economy. Now let's talk about the 3 concepts that are at the very heart of this course: USGBC, GBCI, and the LEED Green Building Rating System. USGBC is the United States Green Building Council. The vision of USGBC is that buildings and communities will regenerate and sustain the health and vitality of all life within a generation. This represents the long-term view of USGBC. Now, their mission describes how it's going to put boots on the ground to attain this vision. They're going to transform the way buildings and communities are designed, built, and operated, enabling an environmentally and socially responsible, healthy, and prosperous environment that improves the quality of life. You'll note how this mission directly ties to the concept of triple bottom line. Now, with their vision and mission in mind, the USGBC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 1993, and it's unique in its approach that it brings together different stakeholders, including building owners, occupants, designers, public advocates, and the product manufacturing industry. Really, it brings us all together, since we all have a stake in occupying healthier buildings. The USGBC created LEED. The first version of LEED, 1.0, was launched in 1998, and this continues today with the recent version 4 launching at Greenbuild in 2013. USGBC also focuses on building community, both at the national level by facilitating dialogue across the industry, as well as locally through the chapter network of over 76 regional organizations. USGBC supports a rich education and research agenda, directing significant resources supporting their partners in education and academia. As stewards of market transformation, while anyone who's been engaged with the building design and construction industry during the last decade is probably now at least aware of LEED, USGBC is the umbrella organization also advocates at every level of government by providing policymakers and community leaders with tools, strategies, and other resources they can use to advance the cause of sustainable building. Now, a couple of things that the USGBC isn't. The USGBC isn't run by the government. The USGBC does not administer LEED credentialing, and they do not administer LEED building certification. Now, those last 2 points, LEED credentialing and certification, and anyone who's been involved with the green building industry for some time may recall a day where USGBC actually did lead both of those efforts. Now, GBCI, the organization we'll talk about here in just a second, now oversees those, and it really is no longer USGBC. So I'd mentioned GBCI, but let's define it now. So GBCI is a companion organization to USGBC, and it's a mutually supportive partnership between two separate and independent nonprofits. So you'll recall USGBC stands for US Green Building Council, and GBCI stands for Green Building Certification Institute, and they've been around since about the beginning of 2008. USGBC develops and maintains the LEED rating system and other roles that we've just discussed, while GBCI directly administers the accreditation of sustainability professionals with the LEED AP and LEED Green Associate credentials, and they oversee the LEED building certification process. So USGBC develops the program, and GBCI assesses compliance for projects to that very same program. And because this relationship is so fundamental to understanding the processes behind LEED, let's take just a quick moment to reinforce this. So GBCI is the organization that you'll go to see when you're ready to register a project, to certify a project, or if you're looking to maintain or to get your professional credentials. Now, the membership side of things is a little bit different. So GBCI, even though it's a nonprofit, does not offer membership. However, USGBC offers membership to organizations only. So as a private citizen, you're unable to register as a USGBC member. Of course, you create a small sole proprietorship and register as the company, but you as an individual or myself cannot register as a USGBC member. However, there is absolutely an opportunity to become a member as an individual of a related organization, because you can sign up as a member of the chapter network. So personally, the local chapter here in my neck of the woods is the Cascadia Green Building Council, but they're across the country and becoming more and more available across the world. USGBC and GBCI have very stringent rules on how to use their proprietary logos, and also on how to use text to describe these organizations and their programs. For organizations, this includes the USGBC at the national level, the chapters, and the membership logos. Now, at the program level, these are the LEED rating systems, including LEED for homes, as well as Green Build. And finally, at the project level, so these are LEED certifications themselves. Now, keep in mind, you can't use them in reference to a project until it's actually been certified. So you couldn't use the LEED certification logo to represent just a registration of a project. However, it may be possible on a individually assessed basis to get special permission from USGBC's marketing department to use these logos in reference to the LEED program in general. Now, the last type of logo here to talk about are the credential logos. Now, these are trademarked by USGBC and provided to the Credential Professional by GBCI. The restrictions are pretty significant here. So it includes who can use the logo, what size the logo can be, the color, the font, the resolution, and whether or not to include the trademark symbols. Explicit permission is always required to use these logos, and this artwork should only come directly from USGBC or GBCI. The final point I'll make on this slide is that text itself is also highly regulated. So a good example here is the word LEED. You would never use periods to separate the letters. It would just be capital LEED, just those 4 characters, There's never an S at the end. It would never be LEEDs. It's always capitalized if you're talking LEED Green Associate, for example. And also, you'll never use the term or just the acronym GA to reference the Green Associate. You'd always spell it out or write out Green ASSOC period. Now let's take a look at some figures to represent how well LEED's penetrated the market. Now this first number we look at are national member organizations. So these are companies, institutions, and organizations that make up USGBC's membership. Over 12,500 organizations have signed on as USGBC members. Now, membership comes with a host of benefits, including the ability to vote on rating systems as they're being balloted. And here we see the chapter network spread all across the country, and in fact, there's certainly chapter affiliations in other countries as well. I know the Cascadia Green Building Council, for example, also has territory in Canada. Now, these 77 chapters have over 30,000 individual members. Now, recall that individuals can only be a member of a chapter and organizations can only be a member of USGBC. So these are individual professionals that have signed up as a member of these chapter organizations. And 30,000 is a tremendous showing there. And here we look at the number of credential professionals. So over 190,000 building professionals across all practices are LEED credentialed. Now this ranges from the LEED Green Associate, which is the primary focus of this course, all the way to these LEED AP specialty credentials, including ID&C and neighborhood development. So we mentioned LEED AP, and while we don't spend an awful lot of time here focused on that credential, I wanted to lay out really the path forward in case you all are interested in exploring that as an option down the road. So the first step to become a LEED AP with the specialty credential is to acquire your Green Associate credential. Now, that Green Associate credential is prerequisite to sitting the actual specialty exam. So while it is possible to take both exams back to back, you'll have to successfully complete that Green Associate exam before you're even allowed to take the AP specialty test. So now that we've covered some of the very basics around who's USGBC, who's GBCI, and what's this LEED program, let's get more in depth about the LEED program itself. So LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Now, a common analogy for LEED is the very familiar nutrition label for food. So anyone that's been to a grocery store, certainly in the US, likely in other parts of the world, has seen this or a similar label on what's a very inexpensive product. So this costs about $1, and it comes with standardized information so that the consumer is aware of what they're buying. Now, the parallel to LEED here is that the scale is quite a bit different, but LEED certification really attempts to do the same thing, to make the building owners and potential owners even aware of the building. What went into this building? What's green about the building? We need a scorecard for buildings, and that's really what LEED tries to do. So we'll discuss many of these terms throughout the course, but I wanted to quickly touch on these. So, we're not going to get into the definitions here, but it is a quick look at the items we'll be reviewing more as we move forward. First of all, we have rating system. Now, rating system, in this case, refers to the Building Design and Construction Rating System, or the LEED for Neighborhood Development Rating System. Within each rating system, there are there are between, I think, 2 and 8 rating system adaptations. Now, with the Building Design and Construction program, there is the full 8 rating system adaptations. So if anyone has a copy of the reference guide for building design and construction, I've got one here that I've reviewed pretty regularly. It lists all 8 of those rating system adaptations in the single book. So those adaptations include LEED for core and shell, LEED for schools, as well as the first version of LEED, which was LEED for new construction. Now, we're also going to be talking about the roles of the folks on these LEED project teams. So that includes the LEED AP, the project administrator, and those roles can certainly be shared by the same, can belong to the same individual. And then a project team member and the certification reviewer, and kind of how all of those parties play into the process. And then finally, start to finish, what do you do to get a building LEED certified? So we'll talk about LEED Online and how that integrates, and then what to expect on the back end once your documentation has been submitted for review. Now, the relationship between LEED and the market at large is really one where LEED drives the market to be more sustainable. So this is a great place to get back to the concept of market transformation. Now, the handshake here represents an agreement between LEED and the market. So now I'd like to refer you to the checklists that should be listed in your resources section, and each of those checklists represents a LEED rating system adaptation. So what's common about those adaptations is that they all have 100 base points. Now, there are, of course, 110 possible points for every LEED project. However, the 100 points that we call the base points exclude those innovation in design and regional priority credits that really are considered bonus points within the program. So bonus points aside, we've got 100 base points for every rating system. Also, what's common about the rating systems is that at each tier there is a different level of certification available. So at 40% of the available points, or in truth 40 points, you'll qualify at the certified level. As we'll discuss, that is not the only thing required to get your LEED certification, but that's the minimum number of points. At the 50-point tier, you'll qualify for a silver certification, and then at 60, you'll be eligible for the gold certification. Then there's a big jump. So you'll notice that each of the jumps between those first three are just 10 points, but the jump from gold to platinum is a much bigger jump. So it's double the increase. So you got to get 80 points to get LEED Platinum. So LEED Platinum projects represents a fairly significant jump from LEED Gold. It's actually a similar jump, at least in terms of points, between LEED Certified to LEED Gold and then LEED Gold to LEED Platinum. Minimum program requirements are also fundamental to this process. So you'll hear me use the acronym MPR to describe minimum program requirements. So that, just get that out of the way. But these MPRs list the basic characteristics that a project must possess to be eligible for certification under every single version of LEED version 4. Well, the specifics vary a little bit, so it's clearly understandable. While the size requirements would be different between a commercial interiors project versus a neighborhood, all LEED projects have the same 3 minimum program requirements. First off, the project must be in a permanent location on existing land. So the concept of existing land it could be a little bit funny to some of us, but a boat or a motorhome, for example, cannot be LEED certified. Permanency is really the critical point here because a significant percentage of LEED prerequisites and credits are dependent specifically on the location. This makes a mobile building or space unacceptable. Now, existing land, this is pretty important here because artificial land masses, which would be the non-existing land, they really disrupt ecosystems and displace entire populations of flora and fauna. So there's been some relatively high-profile projects in the Middle East and elsewhere that have used artificial land masses, and while they do create complete buildings, they would be ineligible for LEED certification. The next MPR is that the project must use reasonable LEED boundaries. The intent behind this is to ensure that fair and consistent evaluation can be had for all projects, particularly under the sustainable sites and the location and transportation categories. In order to ensure a complete and thorough examination of the environmental impacts of a building, all site conditions and their impacts related to the building must be considered during the certification. LEED projects can even have non-contiguous sites. However, all the parcels that are in the LEED certification boundary must be associated with normal building operations and accessible to occupants. And then our final MPR is that the project must comply with minimum floor area requirements. Now, the thresholds and calculations that make up the system of evaluation in LEED really start to break down and lose a lot of their meaning once the building or the space being evaluated reaches relatively minuscule proportions. So with that in mind, the building design and construction and the operations and maintenance rating systems must be 1,000 square feet. So it's not an especially high bar there in terms of size. Interior projects can be as small as 250 square feet, so they can be pretty little, but you can't have, a fuel station kiosk or something like that qualify. Now, LEED for neighborhood development projects need at least 2 habitable buildings, and they have a maximum size of 1,500 acres. And then finally, LEED for homes projects must meet the definition for a dwelling unit, which includes permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. What this means is that a dorm room with a shared restroom could not be a LEED for homes project. However, the building as a whole could be eligible. To contrast that, your typical apartment that does have all of those provisions that make it a dwelling unit, so sleeping, eating, cooking, sanitation, and living quarters, would qualify for that minimum program requirement. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at number 2 here when we talk about LEED boundaries. So the LEED boundary needs to include the project area as well as parking if it's applicable. So while this means that there can be more than one acceptable boundary for a project, these really are declared by the project team and either accepted or rejected at face value by the LEED reviewer. So the project team has a degree of discretion. The one commonality that all LEED project boundaries absolutely need to abide by is that they have to be consistent across all credits. And ultimately, the LEED reviewer has to accept the project team's designation of that boundary. Now, some projects, they may be multiple concurrent LEED applications or located on a campus with some shared resources, can comply with LEED using the campus guidance document that's provided by USGBC. So let's take a look at what that means. So the campus approach uses the site area of the entire campus for certain eligible credits. So I'll give you an example. Rainwater management is a credit in the Sustainable Sites category of LEED, and it involves managing the rainwater that falls on the site and, generally speaking, infiltrating it on the site. It's a little more complex than that, as we'll see when we get into that category. But big picture, you need to infiltrate the majority of that rainwater on your site. Now, there may be the case where it's most appropriate to infiltrate it on a different parcel on the same campus. And what this guidance document does is it clarifies how LEED projects can do that within the scope of the program. So the answer to the rainwater management question is you're absolutely free to infiltrate it anywhere on a contiguous portion of the campus. So it could be 100 feet away. For very large campuses, it may be a mile away. So, but the critical part here is that it's infiltrated on the campus master site itself. Now, there's 2 ways that projects can use this campus guidance document. So it can be on a site with other buildings that use the same amenities. So maybe this is a shared parking structure, or there's some shared site lighting. Or it can be part of a package of multiple buildings seeking LEED certification in tandem. Now, the site can be new or existing as well, so it's not really that exclusive to what types of projects can make use of this, so long as they're either located on a campus with some of those shared amenities, or there are multiple buildings undergoing certification at the same time. So let's look at a quick example of that LEED boundary, how it may work on a campus. So in this simple example, we're saying Building A and Building C are pursuing LEED, and Building B is not. So the campus-wide credits, such as rainwater management, would include elements that may be off of or outside of these LEED project boundaries. So the rain that falls on Building B could very well tie into that central rainwater management strategy that is recognized for the LEED projects involved. Now, another thing that would be shared would be parking. So you'll see here that the LEED project boundaries don't include the parking. However, the LEED application would need to address the parking that's attributed to the building, shown here in the parking lot, which I think we can clearly see from the simple example here, would be accessible to Building A and or Building C occupants. So the parking spaces would need to be factored in where appropriate, but the parking lot itself and the construction, say the construction waste of creating the parking lot, those types of things would not be included. LEED uses a term called FTE that's pretty important. It comes up a lot within the rating system. So FTE is short for full-time equivalent. Now let's take a look at what that means. So 1 FTE equals 1 individual in a building for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Another way to think about it is 1 person in a building for 40 hours every week. So wouldn't have to be number of days in a week. Really, it is hours per week. So what matters here is that 1 individual could equal exactly 1 FTE. But say a part-time employee who, say, works 6 hours a day in that same building, 5 days a week, would not be an entire FTE. They would be a fraction of an FTE. So if it was 6 hours, then it would be 3/4 of an FTE, based on that 1 individual. It's also possible for a single individual to count as more than 1 FTE. So why this is important is that we look at FTE in terms of defining how many uses per day certain types of building amenities will be used. So in the case of water fixtures, you look at the FTE calculation to determine how many times they'll use those flush and those flow fixtures during the course of a basic day. So while an FTE that's in there, say a part-time employee who's there 4 hours a day, they'd be expected to use those same facilities only half as frequently as an otherwise similar individual who's in the building for 8 hours a day. Now there's other type of occupants too that are important but would not be considered within the FTE calculation. So those are generally considered transient visitors. So they include students, visitors, shoppers, or customers. So those are also factor into certain types of calculations throughout LEED, but the FTE is exclusive to building staff or employees that work in the building, and you base it on the number of hours they're in the building on a weekly basis. So now that we've talked about the minimum program requirements necessary for a project to even be considered for LEED registration, let's take a look at how many of these rating system adaptations, such as LEED for building design and construction, new construction, or LEED for operations and maintenance existing buildings, apply to buildings at different points throughout their life cycle. All of these rating system adaptations are listed along a timeline axis based on design, construction, and operations. Now, while all of the rating systems, with the exception of operations and maintenance, cover both the design and construction of the building, the operations and maintenance rating system really comes in after the fact and is suitable for either buildings that are in place today or maybe a building that either did or didn't get a new construction certification and is looking to demonstrate operational excellence through a LEED O&M certification. It is possible, with that in mind, to have a double LEED certification for a building. So while, say, a new office building's going into a downtown core, it can certify under LEED for new construction, and then it can additionally get that O&M certification. So it can have a plaque on, for example, each side of the entry doorway. So let me first clarify a term which we've touched on a couple of times. So the term rating system refers to that top order category. So that includes building design and construction. And the term rating system adaptation refers to the specific suite of credits applicable to a project based on its building type, such as a school. So let's take a look at where each rating system is used and then talk about those adaptations. So first rating system we talk about, and the one that's really the primary focus of this course, and it's certainly the most well-known LEED rating system, is LEED for building design and construction. You'll also hear me use the term B, D, and C. That's really just the acronym here. So within that one rating system are these 8 adaptations. So that includes LEED for new construction and major renovation, LEED for core and shell development, LEED for schools, retail, data centers, LEED for warehouses and distribution centers, LEED for hospitality, and finally LEED for healthcare. These projects are whole building design and construction or major renovation. So a new building, with the exception of a LEED for homes, would always fall within this category. Now, the major renovation part is a little bit tricky. So there's kind of a fine line between what would be a LEED for operations and maintenance project versus a LEED for building design and construction project. And really the important factors are how significant this renovation is. So there's going to need to be a major HVAC, or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning renovation included within the scope. And the reason for that is that there are commissioning requirements fundamental at the prerequisite level within LEED for building design and construction. And if there is no new or major renovation to the HVAC system, it's not necessarily possible that it could even be commissioned. In addition, there needs to be significant envelope modifications. And now, that's really not an absolute, in the sense that if for some reason you found yourself with an existing building that was already sufficiently energy efficient, then it could technically be possible, but that's really going to be the outlier in terms of likelihood. Whereas if you go into a major renovation project, it's quite likely that this is an older building where the glazing system and insulation really isn't up to par with where it would need to be to meet those minimum energy efficiency requirements of LEED. Now, I'll mention one quick distinction. So the core and shell development project is really much different than the rest of these. So core and shell certification does not include the building interior. So when we talk about the next rating system, interior design and construction, those often really are projects within a larger building and are exclusive to the interior, whereas core and shell is the complete opposite. So that's creating the core and the shell of a building while leaving those interiors incomplete, or at least outside of the scope of the core and shell development project. So that would be not for a completed occupiable building, but just for that core and shell. Now, the next rating system we'll talk about, as I'd mentioned, was interior design and construction, or IDC. There are 3 adaptations here. So there's commercial interiors, there's retail, and then there's hospitality. These are complete interior fit-outs of a tenant space. So it may be that they're moving into a new empty core and shell space with or without existing lighting or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Or it may be that they're doing a new interior space, remodeling one that was previously done. So either type of project fits within the scope of ID&C, but it's fundamentally the interior only. And the last rating system we talk about on this page, and then we've got 2 more to cover, is the LEED for Operations and Maintenance program. So there's 6 adaptations here. We have existing buildings, retail, schools, hospitality, data centers, and warehouses and distribution centers. Now these are already completed buildings, and there's typically little to no construction required as part of the O&M certification process. Now, there may be a remodel or that kind of thing that happens in parallel with the O&M certification effort, but it's not required to meet the program requirements. The program instead focuses on sustainable operational practices such as maintenance, water and energy use over time, processes and purchasing policies, waste stream management, and then an ongoing commitment to maintaining exceptional indoor environmental quality. Now, our last 2 rating systems are the LEED for Homes rating system and LEED for Neighborhood Development. Both of these have 2 adaptations within them. So LEED for Homes has the homes and multifamily low-rise adaptation and the multifamily mid-rise. Now, the project scope here are single-family homes or multifamily residential buildings up to 8 stories. Now, those very large residential projects, so say we've got a 9-story condo building, that would be LEED for new construction. Additionally, there must be at least 1 complete dwelling unit within the building. So again, that includes provisions for its own cooking and its own restroom. Now, there is a distinction between these 2 adaptations, and that's based on the number of stories in the building. So a 1 or a 2-story building would always fall into that first adaptation, the homes and multifamily low-rise. Anything over 6 stories and under 8, up to 8, would be multifamily mid-rise. Now that mid-range, the 3, 4, or 5-story project, that could go either direction depending on the Energy Star category that it fits into. So the Energy Star program is pretty important across many of the LEED rating systems, and that they have certain criteria, and they use a parallel set of criteria here to place these homes in one adaptation versus the other, depending on how Energy Star sorts them. And then our final rating system is LEED for neighborhood development. And there's two adaptations here, and they represent different scopes of what could be the same project. So on one hand, we have plan. Now, that represents the planning effort itself and could even be secured. You could have that plan certification in hand before you even break ground on the neighborhood. Now, the project certification, that's really the completed neighborhood. So that certification really it represents a completed neighborhood that's been assessed to meet all of those principles of smart growth, new urbanism best practices, as well as sustainable green building. So we're trying to show a lot of information here on this one slide, and it may be a little difficult to read, but let's take a look again at those rating system adaptations and then how they line up under those rating systems, which are parallel to the distinction made for reference guides. So USGBC has created resource books for these rating systems, and those books are called reference guides. So each rating system has its own reference guide, and within that reference guide are all of the adaptations that are represented here on your screen. So we've got 8 under B, D, and C, all the way down to the 2 versions of LEED for neighborhood development. Now, the most widely used reference guide is the reference guide for building design and construction, shown on the left here in this graphic. The adaptations that can be found in just that one book are NC, CS, schools, retail, data centers, warehouses and distribution centers, hospitality, healthcare. So it's actually a pretty thick book. So the interior design and construction, again, has commercial interiors, retail, and hospitality, and on down this list as we've discussed. Now, the final thing I'll point out before we move on to the next slide is that these not only line up in terms of rating systems and reference guides, it's also the same distinction between, we've got the same 5 categories when we're talking about specialty credentials available as a LEED AP. So you'll recall that there are 5 specialty credentials available for LEED AP credential holders, which is the optional next step after you've completed your LEED Green Associate credential. And these 5 categories are universally used in all 3 of those distinctions. Now, we have several sample questions here as part of this course, and just to get you guys oriented a little bit, what we'll do is we'll read the question and then give about 10 seconds so that you can jot down your answer on a notebook. If you feel you need a little more time, feel free to pause the presentation, record your answer, and then hit play and see if you've gotten it right. So our first question, what is the first level of LEED certification called? Again, about 10 seconds, and then we'll look at the answer. Well, let's see how you've done. So the correct answer here is number 5, certification. Now, our next sample question. An existing building on a campus is going to be renovated. The building will only be repainted and some light fixtures will be replaced. Which LEED rating system adaptation would you use? That in addition to the number of sample questions that do come as part of, well, the course itself as you're reviewing these throughout the course, and we'll have lots of sample questions in the main body of the presentation, but there are also some available practice tests. So jump onto our website, see if there's one that interests you. We have them available there. So the correct answer here is LEED for O&M existing buildings. Now, the next step in this presentation, we're going to take a look at the categories for each of the LEED rating systems and outline the consistent structure that you're going to see within each of these, with each of the rating systems, to see what's similar and then what's different across all of these rating systems. So, as you should recall, these are some of the LEED rating system adaptations and which represents at least one adaptation from each of the rating systems. So we have homes represented here, LEED for neighborhood development, LEED for building design and construction, interior design and construction, as well as operations and maintenance. So this isn't all of the adaptations, but this shows a smattering here of the adaptations that are available. So now let's look at the components of each. So within each LEED rating system, there are categories. So within most of these categories are credit prerequisites. Now, these offer no points to your project, but fundamentally every single prerequisite needs to be achieved. If even one prerequisite is not completed by the project team, the building will not be eligible for LEED certification. So when considering LEED for a project, So the next step after determining that your project meets those minimum program requirements, or MPRs, is to make sure that your project can meet all of the prerequisites for the appropriate rating system adaptation. So in addition to prerequisites, there's also credits within each category that offer points to your LEED project to determine the certification level. This includes LEED Silver or LEED for Gold, or LEED Gold as we've discussed. Credits, however, can be worth a different number of points, and because they don't all have equivalent environmental benefit. So while we have 100 base points, those same 100 points are spread across several credits, worth, in some cases, up to 20 points each. Now, some of these credits offer a way to go above and beyond, and that's known as exemplary performance. So those exemplary performance points are actually tallied in the bonus category that we've talked about, that innovation category. So let's take a closer look at these categories. But before we do, I want to mention two terms that we're seeing here: intent and requirements. Now, the intent represents the environmental goal that the project's trying to achieve, while the requirements gives you really the roadmap or the technical criteria that the project must meet to earn that credit. So we see here all of the LEED categories across all of the rating systems. Now, there's no single rating system that has all categories represented, and as you'll see, there's a lot of commonality between certain rating systems. So this just represents the really big picture. Now, these 6 categories, 5 entries, but we group sustainable sites and location and transportation as they really are a lot of parallels between the two. Now, these 6 categories represent the core categories, and they are used in all of the rating systems with the exception of LEED for neighborhood development. LT is short for location and transportation, and deals with site location, transportation, no surprise there, as well as the connection to the broader community. The SS category, for sustainable sites, represents site selection, site development, and how the project fits into the fabric of the local ecosystem. The WE category stands for water efficiency and addresses both indoor and outdoor water uses, and then innovative technologies such as strategies to reduce the amount of potable water that you need in your cooling tower. The EA category, or energy and atmosphere, looks at using energy efficiently, reducing the grid sourcing of energy needs, and then operational optimizations, including minimizing the direct atmospheric damage that can be done by refrigerant. The MR category, or materials and resources, address life cycle impacts. This includes recycled, regional, rapidly renewable, etc., end of life, as well as product disclosures that are really starting to get a lot of traction here within the industry. And finally, the EQ category, or indoor environmental quality, represents the human health as well as comfort within the building and the connection to outdoors. Now here we look at all of the categories that are in the 4 of the 5 rating systems. So 4 of the 5 systems, all of them except for neighborhood development, have the same 8 categories included within them. So the 2 new categories, we just looked at all the base categories, are the regional priority and innovation. So these 2 categories are the bonus categories that we've talked about. And then finally we have LEED for neighborhood development. So what we've looked at here is how the rating systems are consistent and similar, and honestly how LEED for neighborhood is very different, as the scope of work for that program is much larger, and for that reason it focuses on other categories that are more broadly focused. So the categories addressed in neighborhood development, it does include the regional priority and innovation, but that really is the limit of category overlap with these other rating systems. So SLL, Smart Location and Linkage, addresses the placement of the home or residential development in a societally and environmentally responsible way in relationship to the wider community. It also allows the neighborhood development to take credit for other LEED buildings within the borders of the LEED ND project. Now, the other 2 categories are NPD and GIB. So NPD addresses what to build, or neighborhood pattern and development, that is, addresses what to build. Also, how should it feel in terms of the broader community? So should this parcel be dedicated to shops or a park, or should we put some homes here? It also encourages development that is pedestrian-oriented, compact, and diverse. And finally, green infrastructure in building. This encourages both individual green buildings as well as broad strategies such as neighborhood orientation to help set the stage for the future success of these buildings. And that brings us to our next sample question. So which of the following statements are true of LEED? So take a second to read these questions, jot down your response, pause the presentation if you need to, and we'll take a look at the answer in just a second. Okay, well the correct answers here are 1, 3, and 4, so that all prerequisites are required based on the rating system adaptation. That's true. That LEED categories differ depending on the rating system, also true. And that credits within each category offer potential project points, which determine the LEED certification level. That's also true. Now, the one that isn't true here, that registration is awarded when a project completes all LEED prerequisites. That is false. So registration is granted. It's not really an award since there's no assessment of performance that backs up the registration. The registration is granted as soon as the project pays their registration fee and uploads some basic information to LEED Online. Okay, so now that we've looked at some of the fundamentals behind LEED, let's take a look at really the process itself. So the registration, how the construction, the design and construction progresses, and really where all of the elements of the LEED process fit into a typical project timeline. So here we look at how the LEED process fits into a project timeline. So let's drill down. We're actually going to spend at least a minute here on this slide talking about what we're seeing. So the first graph here shows the relationship between the LEED schedule and the design and construction of a project. Now the lower graphs shows that same schedule relating the LEED rating systems to these phases of a building. So the top one is, I think, a little more complicated, so we're going to start there. Now what we're seeing is that during the conceptual design of a project, which is really where the project team starts to come together, the owner has decided that they want to do a building, they've engaged an architect and the other key designers, and they're asking themselves, should we do LEED for our project? Now, ideally by the end of preliminary design, before the schematic design phase kicks off, they've reached a conclusion. Now, deciding whether or not a project is going to go through a LEED certification process it's not an easy decision, but it does need to be made early in the process. So at the beginning of the SD phase or schematic design phase, you really need to have that decision made. Now, the design of a project in some ways can be broken down into 3 distinct phases. So we have the schematic design phase, design development phase, and then construction documents. And at the end of construction documents, there's a complete set of drawings and specifications that builders would use to inform how they're going to put the building together. They'll also use that or a similar document to bid the project and to go through permitting. But that's probably another conversation altogether. Now, at the end of design, the project can proceed with their design phase review of their LEED certification. So, we'll get into all the details later, but the LEED design or the LEED reviews process can be either a 1-stage process or a 2-stage process. And each of those stages is actually made up of several other sub-stages, but you can either do a design phase review and then a construction phase review, or you can do a combined review at the end of construction. Most projects see value in doing the 2-stage review, but for smaller projects or those that for whatever reason wanted to make just a single push through their LEED documentation, may do the combined review at the end of construction. But whether the project does or doesn't do a design review, at the end of construction documents, the project will go through permitting, it'll be approved, it'll then get constructed, and at the end of construction, the LEED documentation package will be finalized, whether it's the construction credits or the design and construction credits together, and then it'll be submitted for certification. The building then goes into service and would be an operating building. So right between the design development phase and the construction documents phase, so about 2/3 of the way through design, you'll see here on your screen, we've got a little star, and if you can make out those letters in there, they're pretty small, I know. It says CXA, and that is for commissioning authority. The CXA is really shorthand, meaning commissioning authority, as we'll discuss when we get into the energy and atmosphere category. Why that's important is that they're at the prerequisite level, and this is a new requirement in LEED version 4, so many of your existing project team members might not be aware of this, so it's really important to keep in mind. The commissioning authority must be designated by the end of the design development phase. Now, that is a prerequisite requirement. What that means is that if you waited until mid-construction documents to issue an RFP for your commissioning authority, they get on the project team, you've already missed that critical deadline and are not in compliance with the prerequisite. So that's a big deal, because missing a prerequisite means you cannot get certification. Now the next building life cycle graph we show here, this one's pretty straightforward. So we have 4 phases of a building as we're describing it here. So the concept, then the core of the building, and the interior. So we're looking at separating those out. So we have the core of the building and the interior, and then the operations and maintenance side. So this is really another way of looking at how the building rating systems fit into not the timeline of a project, but what their scope is in terms of the building itself. So there is no rating system that addresses the conceptual design of a building. However, there is a rating system, as we've talked about, that's specific to just the core and shell. It's ironically named LEED for Core and Shell. The LEED for Commercial Interiors, or LEED, more broadly, the LEED for Interior Design and Construction Rating System and their adaptations, including LEED CI, address just the interior of a building. Well, finally, most of the other rating systems, including LEED for New Construction, LEED for Schools, LEED for Healthcare, and really all of the building design and construction rating system adaptations, with the exception of Core and Shell, address both the core and the interior of a building. And then, of course, the operations and maintenance side is addressed exclusively by the operations and maintenance program, including the adaptation for existing buildings. Central to successful LEED projects is an integrative process. So what we see here is a bid project. So that's one where the contractor and their team is not involved during design, but of course the design team and the client or owner are at the table. Now, the typical planning and design process is one of relying on the expertise of specialists who work in their respective specialties, somewhat isolated from each other in their own respective cylinders of excellence. Now, the architect is typically the one tasked with being the conduit of communication. So it may be that the civil engineer reports to the architect, who filters that information and disseminates it as appropriate to say the landscape architect and the plumbing engineer. Now that would be essentially where you've got one single party really overseeing all of the communication. Now the integrative approach is one that asks all the members of a project stakeholder community and the technical planning, design, and construction team to look at the project objectives, the building materials, the systems and assemblies, and the like from many different perspectives. What this means on the ground is that several whole team meetings throughout the design phase involving all those stakeholders are convened, and they evaluate the cost, quality of life, future flexibility, efficiency, and the overall environmental impact of these design decisions. This typically begins with a design charrette, sometimes called an eco-charrette if it's focused on ecological or sustainability issues, which is a focused collaborative brainstorming session held at the beginning of a project to encourage the exchange of ideas and information and allow for a truly integrative process to take form. Now, the integrative approach also works for a design-build project, which is a project where the contractor and their team are part of the conversation from the very beginning. Now, during construction, if the builder and their team members weren't involved during design, they're of course integrated during the construction. Now, critically, the integrative process does not stop once construction begins. That's so important. So once the construction gets underway, the builder assembles their team, and then ideally a full team meeting brings all stakeholders back together to review the LEED project goals. So remember, in this integrative approach, we'd have all team members participate at early stages of design and throughout all of design and construction as soon as they come on board with the project. Now that you've determined that LEED is right for your project through an initial assessment of the minimum program requirements and the LEED credit prerequisites, and you've determined which rating system and adaptation your project is going to fit into, and now that you have a better understanding of the design and construction process, well then what comes next? Let's take a brief look at what a typical LEED process would look like. So first of all, we've assessed that LEED is right for the project and the project is ready to move forward. First of all, they would register their project on LEED Online. Now there's some basic project details that of course can be edited or updated later. Maybe the project name is a placeholder and it's, Block A project, and later on it'll have, a name after a benefactor or the like. So all of those can be changed at a later date. Additionally, you'll pay a flat rate registration fee with a discount for USGBC members. After that is complete, the project has a registered status and it's free to claim that it is a LEED registered project. Careful though, definitely don't claim it's LEED certified. Then the project starts completing some supplemental documentation. So this includes a project narrative that would describe several aspects of the project, including its use. Photographs or renderings, elevations, some floor plans, and then some details. And then finally, the LEED project boundary, as we've already talked about in the minimum program requirements. Then what happens on a lot of projects is they'll come across a question that they don't have an answer to. Say they want to try an innovative strategy, but they don't know if that's going to be acceptable to the LEED reviewer. Credit interpretation requests, or CIRs, represent an avenue for the project to get those answers before they make critical decisions on their project. So take an example. Say that there's a waterless urinal that wants to be used on a project. Now, as we'll see, those actually fit pretty neatly into the program and wouldn't warrant a CIR necessarily, but say there was a lack of clarity around how those fit into the water use calculations. You could propose an approach and then submit it via the CIR process, and the LEED reviewer will look at that and say, yes, that approach will be acceptable, or no, here's how you do it instead. So it gives you an avenue to get those questions answered. Now, keep in mind there is a modest fee to ask those questions, so you'll want to be careful about asking too many because they could start to add up. So, and the final point about credit interpretation requests is that even if you receive a favorable response, it does not guarantee that you'll achieve that credit prerequisite or minimum program requirement. The key here is that they're evaluating and approving an approach, not necessarily evaluating and approving the credit prerequisite or MPR. Then the project proceeds into the certification. So we talked about the potential two-stage certification process, which is generally how we'll describe it as the two-stage process, but don't forget that it is possible to submit all of it together in the construction phase submission. So during certification, you'll assemble your documentation, you'll submit it for review to GBCI. The GBCI will give you an initial preliminary review, which you'll be able to respond to, and then a final review. Now, after the design phase certification, or the design phase review, your credits and prerequisites and your minimum program requirements will be marked as denied if it's not approved, or it'll be marked as anticipated, which is different than it'll be marked as after the construction phase. And I'll mention why here in just a second. Now, the construction phase is pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is what they'll mark the successfully documented credits as. So at the end of design phase, it'll be marked as anticipated, because theoretically nothing's been built at the end of just the design phase. And then at construction, you're telling GBCI that it was constructed as you've claimed. So at that point, they can actually award the credit, marking it as achieved. Now, there is a fee for the certification that's based on the size and on the rating system of the project. The final review that is optional for all projects is an appeal review. So it's not uncommon for a project to not earn one of its targeted credits. or prerequisites in the extreme case. So that means that the project, after its final review, does not earn enough credits to get the certification that they wanted. Or maybe they did, but they really wanted USGBC to recognize their strategies for a credit. They can appeal that credit, and it will it'll go back into review, and they'll be able to submit some additional documentation, maybe to clarify how they actually did meet the requirements and/or intent, or they've changed something and now they're in compliance. The LEED for Homes certification process it's really completely different, and is broken up into 4 stages. So first, the project registers. Much like the other LEED rating systems, this includes submitting some completed documentation, including the forms that are applicable to this rating system. You'll also submit payment, and what's very different is you'll establish your verification team. So LEED for Homes has 3 very unique parties that are only present for the LEED for Homes process. So that includes the homes provider, the green rater, and then the energy rater. And during the registration process, that would be the appropriate time for the project team to establish their goals. So are they shooting for LEED certified, or maybe it's a LEED Platinum home? Then the project would go through its design, construction, and the like, and during construction, there's a series of field verification visits. Again, this is completely unique for LEED for Homes. No other LEED programs have field verification component. So there's a mid-construction visit and then a final construction visit. Also during this phase is the preparation of several documents that support the sustainable design of this home, or sustainable construction. That's the durability plan, the construction documents, or really the drawings and specs themselves. And also you need to have a copy of the contract, which identifies the scope for various trades. Now, you don't have to disclose the dollar numbers involved. Those can certainly be redacted, but the contract that describes the scope of the builders is really important here. Show that at least. Next comes the review. So this includes the preliminary review and the final review, much like the other versions of LEED, but also a re-review option, just like the appeal process. And after that, GBCI will do a final review and mark your credits as achieved or denied, and also offer avenues to share the successes of your project. So we mentioned the inspection process with the homes provider and green rater. Now let's take a quick second to talk about exactly what they do in the field. So now, while we'll get into commissioning a little bit later, I wanted to point out that homes don't undergo a standard commissioning process. However, they do have an aligned process for those in-field inspections. And under the LEED for Homes rating system, the green rater is selected and trained by the LEED for Homes provider to model the home's energy performance, inspect the air and moisture barrier, the installation of insulation, to test the air tightness of the home, and to verify installation of the green features. The project team hires the provider, and the provider, in selecting the green rater, sends them into the field to verify. Now, because they're not hired by the project team, the green rater maintains a degree of objectivity. Okay, and now our 4th sample question. So which statements about the LEED process are true? Again, we'll take about 10 seconds, so go ahead and jot down your response, pause the presentation if you'd like, and then we'll discuss the answers. Okay, so the correct answers here are 1 and 3. So that no credits are awarded during the design phase submittal. You'll recall that they're marked as anticipated, not achieved. And if the execution of the design phase credit changes during construction, it must be resubmitted during the construction phase submittal. So that's exactly why they mark it only as anticipated, because things change in some cases very drastically between completion of design and the end of construction. Whether it's due to budget issues or redesign or a change in client expectations, or for a host of other reasons. Things can change, and LEED certainly understands that and offers an avenue for the project team to correct anything that's been changed. Okay, so for the majority of this course, we'll be covering the prerequisites, credits, intents, and the requirements found in the Green Building Design and Construction Rating Reference Guide, with an emphasis on the credits used in the LEED for New Construction rating system adaptation. So let's recap a little bit of this critical vocabulary, and then we'll jump into the categories themselves. So the critical vocabulary here is rating system, which would be LEED for Building Design and Construction. We have rating system adaptation, which would include LEED for new construction. The reference guide, which is the source document that describes these programs. The rating system document is also available, and that one's available at no cost. But the reference guide itself is really where all of the great information is held. The categories, or credit categories, are represented in each of these rating systems. In each category, there are credits and potentially some prerequisites. And each of those credits and the prerequisites have intent and requirements, and in some cases, offer exemplary performance for going above and beyond. So these are the categories we're going to be looking at in depth throughout the course. So let's begin with the prerequisites and credits in the location and transportation category.